talk about an overview of some of the key decisions that you're going to have to make. Now, this is somewhat of a difficult video because we really need to be in the installation itself so that we can sort of organically come upon these decisions and have discussions. But I thought it would be worthwhile for us to talk about some of the higher up things, some of the higher level things, hardware decisions, edition decisions. And then once we get into the installation, we can focus more on the options and the features and the products that we encounter during the installation here, okay? So let's jump in. Remember that we're dealing with an overview course. I would suggest to you that if you plan to do the exercises, the labs throughout this course, that you go through and install all of the components. Now, we talked about this a couple of times in chapters 1 and 2. Express Edition is not going to give you integration services and analysis services. Okay? You're only going to be able to do some of the database engine and some of the reporting services, okay? But you still want to install the management tools. Okay, but the developer edition and the other editions will give you the ability to install analysis services and integration services. So if you want to later do the exercises in those chapters, make sure that you install those components, those products would be the technical word, as I do during the installation. Okay, now just kind of a reminder, maybe just kind of give you a heads up. This is an intro level class, right? This is, therefore, an intro-level installation. And what I mean by that is that I'm not going to go super deep. I'm not going to cover all of the key parts and all of the major decisions that everybody has to make to go into production, right? I'm here to give you a high-level overview, okay? For a production installation, you're going to need to know more. Okay, this is a good overview. This is enough to get you set up on a developer machine, on your own personal machine. But if you have to go out and install a cluster, well, this is you don't have enough information yet, right? So that's where the depth courses, the documentation, those will have that supporting information. Okay, let's just kind of get an overview. I have listed 9 key decisions. Are there more? Of course, right? But these are definitely 9 that we have to cover, even at an intro level, okay? Now, some of the decisions that are not listed here that would be listed in the depth courses, if we're dealing with the database engine, are we installing this on a clustered server? Do we need to use always-on availability groups? Okay? Some of the decisions that we might have to make on a reporting server would be, do we install this as a standalone reporting server? Are we going to separate the reporting server and the SQL Server onto separate machines? Analysis services, we have to decide multidimensional or tabular or SharePoint mode, right? So those are much more in-depth decisions than we have the time for really to go into in an intro course. Just kind of giving you an idea. So here's what we're going to do. Let's walk through these 9, give a quick talk about them, okay, and then we'll get into some demos in the next video. Now, number 1. Oh, well, before we get into number 1, let's talk about how you uncover some of this information. Right, so I think it's pretty common in the workplace today to use this term needs analysis, right? You perform a needs analysis to figure out things like, what are our current needs? I find that the concurrent users metric is a great metric to kind of give a benchmark for what sort of hardware needs that we're going to have, what edition that we might decide, which operating system should we use, right? So concurrent users, I find, is a really good one. But you also need to start thinking about the future, right? It does no good today to buy a server that is only going to last for 6 months before it has to be upgraded. So I would definitely go out at least 2 years. It's, fuzzier as you get out, but with today's CPUs and the prices of CPUs and memory today, you should be able to spec out a box for most systems. That's, and by that I mean most systems that are kind of stable and growing 10% a year, 20% a year in terms of the database size. I think you'll be able to build together a system that's going to last you no less than 3 years. Okay, that would be your goal, no less than 3 years. Hopefully you can make it 5 years. And by that point, it may be somebody else's problem. You don't know, but you may have to upgrade it at that point. But you want to perform that needs analysis. You're looking at what hardware should we purchase. And we'll talk about that. That's in our list of the 9 here, okay? I do have a suggestion here. A really great book, I think, is a book called SQL Server Hardware. Okay, now Glenn Berry came out with this in, I want to say this was in 2011. So the hardware that it mentions is maybe a year old, but the concepts and the thinking process that Glenn takes you through for picking out your hardware and how to design servers and choose servers prior to the installation, that's just stuff that can go with you the rest of your life. So I would really encourage you to take a look at that book. I think it's $25, $30 or something. Really, Glenn is a great writer. He's got a great blog. I'm a big fan of that book. And I always think it's really important to support creative books. Okay, so, it's not your typical SQL Server database administration, right? I mean, this is something that, boy, Glenn, he really took a lot of time. He's got a lot of metrics, got a lot of good suggestions for which tools to use. So I can't recommend that book enough. Okay? Now, let's go through our first decision. Number 1, which SQL Server edition? And we talked about this, right? In Chapter 2, we walked through all the different editions. And I said then, make sure you take your time and get this right. Don't buy the standard edition if a year from now you're going to find out that you're running up against that 64 gig memory component, right? Or you need more than 4 sockets or 16 cores, okay? Because there is no, discount, okay? So take your time, make sure you get that right. One important note is you can move your databases across editions at will. So I can take a database from Developer Edition. I can take a backup of that database. I can restore it on an Enterprise Edition. I can restore it even on an Express Edition. Okay? However, I cannot go down a version. So you're probably familiar with the product versions. You'll see something like 11.0.440.0. Okay? Well, when SQL Server goes through that restore process, it looks at the database that version belonged on. And if you try to put it on 11.0.100.0, it says, no, sorry, you cannot go down a version. Okay. Now, it would allow me, though, to go up a version. So I could go into 11.0.871, and I'd be okay, right? So I'd get a big green check mark that would allow me to go up a version. Okay, I can upgrade that database, but I cannot downgrade that database. If that's a bit confusing, one way to say this is if I had a database on SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1, I could not support it, at least. I could not take a copy of that database and restore it on SQL Server 2012 RTM, the release to manufacturing version. Okay, I couldn't go down. I could restore it on another SP1 server or even an SP2 server because that would be going up. I would be either doing the same version or going up. I just can't go down a version. Okay? As for licensing, we covered that already, right? So this is where your needs analysis will decide whether you need a CPU license or a number of client access licenses, right? So this is where you want to bring in an expert, right? These guys get paid based on your licensing needs, right? So bring them in. Now, as for the operating system supported, I have a list of the main ones supported. I do not have a comprehensive list up here. For example, some of these are only supported on 64-bit. Some of them are supported on 32-bit and 64-bit. Some of them are ultimate. Some of them are professional. It depends on the edition of the operating system. I didn't want to bore you with a huge chart. You could pretty much think, though, that the furthest we're allowed to go back is Vista SP2. Right? Now, this kind of stuff, to me, this is rote memorization. This is stuff I can find at any moment that I want to by looking in the documentation. This is not the kind of stuff that I need to memorize unless, what's the one case that I need to memorize this? If I have to take a certification exam, right? Microsoft is very interested in this, us knowing these operating system requirements, and can you install this on Windows Millennium Edition, right? So, if that's where you're wanting to go, then you will need to notice this, and you will need to really pay close attention to this. In a production environment, most of the time, this sort of thing is covered because we're running Windows 2008 SP2 or R2 or the new Windows Server 2012. Okay. 32-bit or 64-bit. We somewhat talked about this already. You definitely want to use 64-bit for your servers. 32-bit would be fine if you just have a single developer machine that doesn't need a lot of horsepower, doesn't need a lot of memory. Memory, certainly where you get a huge benefit from going to 64-bit, right? Again, if you pull up the PDF form that's attached with this video, you can go to these URLs that I have down here at the bottom, and they will just give you the system and operating system and hardware requirements. Okay? So I'm going to use 64-bit throughout this course. I would recommend you do as well. As for the hardware, I'll just list a couple of minimums here. You want a minimum of 6 gig hard drive space. I can remember the days of SQL Server when it was 256 megs, and that was SQL Server 2000, I think. That's the one that's popping in my head right now. And we used to make fun of Oracle way back in the day because, gosh, they had to have 2 gigabytes to do just an installation. Oh, how times have changed. So the memory, the minimum memory is that if you're using the Express edition, you're going to be working with 512 meg, right? And the others is 1 gig, right? That's the absolute minimum that you would want to use, okay? So this is not necessarily the recommended minimum. I think that it's hard to say what is the recommended minimum because the true recommended minimum comes from the workload on the server, right? You have to have a needs analysis to tell you what's going to happen on the server. Once you have that, then you can say, okay, well, this would be the minimum amount of memory that you would be able to get by with. CPU, they have some other lists like, I think it's 1.0 gigahertz for single core CPUs and 1.4 for dual core, I think is what it is, or multi-core. But the 2.0 gigahertz would be what they have actually listed in their spec sheet as the minimum recommended. Okay, so again, this is the exact link that was in the previous page. It also has the hardware requirements. Okay. As for the security model and accounts, from this point forward in the video, we're going to get into areas where it's we need a screen to talk about. So I'm going to tell you about some of these decisions, and then when we get into the next couple of videos and we're actually starting to do the installation, then we're going to be able to talk about those with pictures and be a little more detailed about them. So we have this idea of the security model, right? So a security model simply defines how people gain access to resources, right? And a resource, let's just kind of define what a resource would be, right? This could be a database. It could be a table. It could be a row, a function, a stored procedure. It's an object. It's something, okay? So the security model defines how it is accessed, what permissions would be required to access that. You're commonly using things like users and groups, and right, those are terms that I think most of us are familiar with that, right? Do you log in with your user account on Windows, or do you log in by typing in a username and password? Okay, that's the security model. Those are parts of, rather, the security model. Now, every one of the products, reporting services, analysis services, database engine, integration services, is going to have its own security model, okay? So we're going to cover those when we get into the individual chapters, okay? So I'm not going to detail this just too much yet. Every one of the products also has its own service account, right? So we'll see the default service accounts that SQL Server 2012 will try to install for us during the installation as well. And we're going to let it in this course, Okay? A service account, in case you are not familiar with it, when an application logs in to a computer or a network, it has to log in just like you do with a username and a password. Okay? Now you can share your username and your password with an application, but how do you know what they're going to do with it? Okay? That would be an elevated privilege. You wouldn't want to give SQL Server your username and password. Okay? You would want to give SQL Server its own username and password so that, well, we don't want to cover the principle of least privilege yet. We will talk about that a little bit later in the course. Okay? But every one of the products has at least one service account. Okay? So, like I said, we'll cover each of these during the videos. Okay? Now, number 7, which of the products are you going to install and where? Okay, so in many environments, you'll end up having multiple servers. Okay, you'll have, here's a box over here, and you're just going to install the database engine on that one, okay? And then here, you're just going to install reporting services. And then here, you install analysis services. And maybe here also, you'd install SSIS, okay? Or maybe that's a separate server. So during your needs analysis, you're going to figure out which products solve your problems, and you're going to then match that up with the hardware. Can I run this on the hardware given the number of concurrent users, right? How about in 2 years? How about in 3 years? Okay. And then you're going to make the decision, do I need 2 servers? Maybe I need 4 servers. Maybe I need virtualization. Okay. So what products will you install will be a key part. And which of the features of that product will you install? Okay. So if you're doing an analysis services, for example, are you using Tabular? Are you going to do SharePoint? If you're doing the database engine, will you enable FileStream? Okay. Those are all features of the various products. So you'll have to dig down into those products and learn a little bit more about each of those before you know the right answer. And again, we'll talk about Tabular and SharePoint in later chapters. Okay. All right. So we'll go through them more. Okay. Last one. Okay. Last key part before we can get into doing some demos here. Collation. Okay. I've been talking about collation for 15-something years, and it's finally, I think, just gotten pretty easy about it. Collation, it can be defined in one single sentence. It defines how character data is compared and sorted. Okay? Now, key point here, okay, compared. We're talking about, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. We're talking about a where clause. Let's say that you write a SQL where clause that says where city equals New York. Okay? And so you have data, and we'll just draw a little table here. Let me see if I can remember the straight lines. Okay, so imagine that this is what your table data looks like here. Give me just a second here to write it out. I got to get that small enough. Okay, so here's one for New York. Here's one for New York. Here's one for New York. And that's enough for us to come up with an understanding. Which of these 3 will match the comparison? Okay, so now let's just focus on the comparison, not the sort characteristics. Let's just focus on the comparison. Okay, does New York match New York? Yes or no? Does New York match New York? Excuse me. It's not as simple as yes or no. The answer is always, what's the always answer, especially in the database administration world? It depends, right? We have to talk about case sensitivity, don't we? Okay? These have different, we have the same letters, but different cases. Okay? So it depends. Are we doing a case sensitive comparison or a case insensitive comparison? And in this case, it's going to be the collation of this column. If we look at the definition of this column, it actually says whether or not this column is case sensitive or case insensitive. We can even, during the comparison, during the query, we can override those comparisons. But by default, every column has a collation. Okay, or every character column has a collation that defines how it is compared. Okay, is it And one of those key comparisons would be case sensitivity, okay? So let's say that this one is case sensitive, okay? So that's the collation of the city column defines that it's case sensitive. So would this be a match? Would New York match New York? No, right? Because it's not case sensitive, okay? How about down here? New York, yes, okay? Oops, sorry, I meant that to be green. And New York obviously would fail here, okay? Because of the case sensitivity issue, okay? Now, if we made this, if we changed it and said, wait a minute, let's make that now case insensitive. Then now we're back to, and let me see if I can, I'm gonna have to do this. So this now matches. Doesn't matter that this is Y is of a different case, as long as it's a Y, okay? So that's what we mean by comparison. There are other things like accents, like for example, we'll change this, we'll do this again. So let's say, oops, sorry. Let's say, I'm struggling here, where city equal, we'll just say angstrom, okay? And so your data down here is angstrom, okay? And I'm going to, I don't know the keyboard shortcuts here, but let's say that we have the little circle there and that we have the dots here, okay? These are accents, okay? So accent sensitivity is another issue. If I define the collation of the city column and I say that it is accent sensitive, okay, that means that the accents have to be the exact same. Okay. Notice that in the source right up here, there are no accents. Therefore, this would be the only match. Okay. If I said it was accent insensitive, then these would also match. You see, that collation is very, very important. When it comes to comparisons, this is how you find a match, right? The sorting is the same way. Does an A with an angstrom sort before an A without an angstrom? Okay, that's how your sorting is going to work. Does a capital A sort before a lowercase a? Okay, so the collation defines how your character columns, character data, are compared and sorted. Okay, now when we install SQL Server 2012, we define the default collation, and that sets the collation for the system objects, but it also sets the default collation for when you create new tables and new databases by default. Okay? You can, of course, override that during creation, okay? But you can't go back and change the default collation. Okay? For you to change the default collation basically is a reinstallation of the SQL Server and choosing a new default collation. Okay? And it's a huge pain. You don't want to have to do that. Okay? So the default collation we're going to set for the server, okay, can be overridden when we create databases, and we will see that when we go through it. All right, let's come back in the next video.